So this video is going to go over the slides that we would have covered in class for writing for media. I'm going to break the slides up for these videos so that you don't just get a ton of me talking for a full hour, so you can go through and pull the sections that you need to and watch them in the order that you want to. So just remember that this is going to be stuff that when we come together on Friday looking at our writing, I will expect you to have seen. So in this first section, we're going to talk about news stories. So one of the things that, just starting off for framing, we're talking here specifically about print media. We're going to talk about how this then compares to the web going forward. But one of the things to keep in mind is how kind of economic and social changes are going to affect newspaper, magazine, print in general. So across the board over the past 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 years, there has been consistent decline in the number of newspapers and magazines sold. Maybe not 50, maybe that's hyperbole, but you get the idea. Now, there have been several things that newspapers and magazines have done to try to combat this declining circulation numbers. That includes relying more heavily on advertising revenue. So again, if you look at something like for magazines, you look at Vogue's September issue. Part of the reason why it's so thick and so weighty is because of the fact that it is packed with advertising. So there's been like this courtship between print and ads, which then kind of informs how the beginning of these things on the web was kind of formed, and now they've kind of caught up. Another thing that a lot of places have done is cut back on staff, relying more and more on freelancers. And we see this across, not just in print media, but across the board, a shift from people having staff to having freelancers, permalancers, and, the ever popular gig economy. And one of the ways that they've done that is in the case of newspapers, you might merge newspapers from different locations. So the core of the paper is going to be the same no matter where in the country you are. And they'll keep on a couple people to cover local news and to kind of slot that into very specific areas within the paper. But overall, it's like a syndication where the same stories are covered no matter where you are. It's interesting, though, to then note that hyperlocal coverage is actually not just like made a comeback, but is booming because of the fact that people are then dissatisfied with the fact that, if you pick up a local paper, you want it to have, so say you live in the middle of the Midwest, if you pick up your local paper, you don't want to necessarily be hearing about things that are happening in Boston. So a lot of people then get dissatisfied with the fact that their local paper is mostly covering things from all across the US. And so places that are very specialized actually have done quite well. So you kind of either need to be a generalist, because people do feel like, well, if I'm going to read about what's happening in Boston, New York, DC, California, like I might as well just get one of the big ones, like the Washington Post, the New York Times, one of those. So those ones have done fine, but then the ones that have been super local and said, we're not going to cover the things that are happening elsewhere, we're just going to focus on us in our local area, have done relatively well. And then, of course, the other thing that they've done is to converge with other media. So instead of just being print, we now have online. We have various different media. And in fact, most of the media that we'll look at, you can have a journalistic bent on. So again, broadcasting, think about podcasts. You can think about TV. You can think about long-form journalism in documentaries and serial shows. So we can kind of see it in lots of different areas. And of course, the web, as we're going to be talking about. So, and again, originally, they tried to bring the way of thinking from the print into online. And then finally, we've kind of got to a point where we've adapted to the new area. So what do I mean by a news story? I know, again, about half of you guys have taken journalism already, so you guys are probably pretty comfortable with this. There is a whole review of the inverted pyramid format in a separate learning module that just reviews that. So it uses the inverted pyramid, which is a story structure where you place the most important information at the top of your story and you work your way down from the most important information to the least important information. When we talk about respecting the reader's time, using brevity, this is one way in which we can do that. If you only have time to read the first couple sentences, the first couple paragraphs, you get the most important information. You don't withhold anything. Your stories will be written in the third person, and you're going to be striving for objectivity. It means you're going to be, as much as possible, trying to take yourself and your viewpoint out. Now, obviously, that's not possible and entirely. We all have our implicit biases that we're not aware of. But one thing that people strive for is an attempt to be as objective as possible, to cover both sides of the story. And this is impacted in kind of the ethics, which is one thing that, again, we'll try to weave in throughout, because part of what's kind of baked into American culture and politics is that there's no accreditation needed to cover the news, be a journalist, for print, online, doesn't matter. It's actually something that's in the First Amendment. The First Amendment actually covers an awful lot. It's more than what you think it is. There's actually 5 different rights that are conferred by just that one amendment. And in there is that there is no body that's going to tell someone that they can't be a journalist. You can't get struck off the record the way you can in other professions. And so that means that there's no rule saying you have to be ethical, but in order to have our democracy work correctly, you need to strive to be ethical, because there's a lot of power and a lot of responsibility that comes with covering the news. And so one of the things we're going to see, especially when we get into the web, where there's fewer gatekeepers, let's say, is that if you are writing something that is meant to be informative, you need to be aware of how people are going to understand what you write, and that there is that responsibility that comes with it. And if you choose to succumb to pressures from outside, be it in politics, be it in other areas, that it has an impact on people and has an impact on our society. So in a couple weeks, we're going to talk about ethics around reviews, and we're going to look at a case that's happened just in the past couple of months, and just to kind of think about and keep in your mind the fact that you are writing for an audience and what that means in terms of the ethics. And the next set of slides, the next part of the set of slides, we're going to look at specifically what do we mean by a news story, and a quick look at an approach to how we would structure some writing.